All right, it's finally time. This is what we've been building up to the entire course. And from here, this is where the rest of the course will focus. Let's build a web server in Node. So I have my empty app.js file, and I'm going to go use the require function and get the core HTTP module. Now I could call this variable whatever I wanted, but it's normally just called HTTP in most Node code that you see. So this goes out and gets the HTTP module and what's attached to module.exports in the core code, and then I can say dot create server. That's a method available to me that creates a new server object. And this call to this function takes a callback, a function that I pass to it to be invoked. And this turns out to actually be an event listener, so that when this server object emits a particular event, this function will be called. If I dig back into the bowels of the Node.js source code, in the _http_server.js file, deep down in the Node.js source code, I see that this server object, which is an event emitter, meaning that it is faking events, it has an events object that has a request property on it, and when I gave it that function, it will invoke it when a request occurs. And it will pass to the function that I give it two objects, one representing the request and one representing the stream where I can stream the response back. So it gives me those two parameters. Now I could call them A and B or whatever, but typically we call them request and response. So this represents the request coming, and this is my way of sending back a response. So then inside this function that I've given that will be executed when a request happens, that is closer to the machine, the C side of the code sees that a request has happened, which causes a JavaScript event, a faked event, to be emitted, then this function is run. And so I need to build a response. And remember, an HTTP response starts with what's in the head. So I can say write head. That's a method for me to help me build that string ultimately that represents an HTTP response. I can say what my status code is, what's in that first line. And then I can specify the headers, those name-value pairs. An easy way to do that would be to use an object, since an object is name-value pairs. And that's just what Node lets me do. So I'll say content type, and I'll wrap it in quotes because even though a JavaScript object doesn't require that the name of the property be in quotes, it is allowed. And the other problem is that some of the HTTP names for the name-value pairs for the headers are not valid JavaScript variable names. So if I did it without quotes, it might give me an error. But with quotes, JavaScript will let me get away with it. Then I can give it a value. I'll give it a MIME type. Usually in the early examples in other Node courses and books, the first thing they'll do is send some plain text back, not HTML. And the MIME type for plain text is text/plain. And that tells the browser what I'm giving back is just plain text. And then I'll send the body. There's a send method I could use, but I'll just use the end method, which means I'm done sending. This is the last thing that I'm sending. And we'll just send something simple. Hello world. And then to be good, we'll send in carriage return, which is this \n in JavaScript, which just means a new line and a good and proper way to end your data. And that's it. I've built the response. Now we're missing one thing. Where does Node map to the port? How does it know that when the information is sent to a particular port, that Node should receive that information so that it causes that request event to emit? Well, create server itself, while I give it a function, which will be invoked when the event happens, itself creates an object, and on that server object, I have a .listen event that I have access to. And remember, listen is just a metaphor for when information comes to the server, here's the port that if it's sent to that port via that port portion of the address, then send it to me, please. Send it to this program that's running. And I could listen to any number of ports. Let's just try 1337. And then another parameter would be the address that we would be looking for. And this is the standard internal IP address for the local system, or what's sometimes called localhost. So that means if I type localhost in my browser, that will translate to this IP address, and since I'm running this locally, that will work, and 1337 would be the port. In other words, I would put localhost :1337, and that means that when the browser makes this request, then this process will receive that request. And the HTTP parser wrapped up inside that JavaScript code will give me the request, and then I can send back the response. And that's it. This is the typical kind of introductory Node code that you see. And it took us a while to get here, but I hope you appreciate how important it was to understand everything that goes into this before we actually write it, how it helps us understand it, and how it helps us appreciate just how much is really going on. So we understand the require function and getting it from the Node.js core. We understand then that this is creating an object and giving a callback, which actually is turned into an event listener using the event emitter code inside Node.js, and that I have an HTTP request and a response which has some methods which allows me to send information back down the stream. Things like the status and the headers that are information that the browser will use to interpret what I'm sending, and the body, the data itself that I'm sending, and that Node.js will take all this information and create a properly formatted HTTP response that the browser can then understand and is programmed to do things with. And ultimately, this listen for the port and address will make sure that that request from the browser is routed properly to this code, ultimately. All right, so let's run this. The first thing I need to do then is run the program, but this is going to work a bit differently than the programs we've run before. I'll say node app.js, run this JavaScript file, and it runs, but notice it's still sitting there waiting. The program continues to run, because when I created this server, that caused some code to run that simply sits there and waits for a request. So the Node program doesn't stop. It doesn't exit out of the program code. It just sits there and keeps running, waiting for a request. So we need to give it a request. The best way to do that is my internet browser, which is designed to build HTTP requests and understand HTTP responses. So I'll say localhost to give it a port 1337. Localhost means my local server. Normally this would be a domain name pointing at some server where I've pushed this code. But in this case, we'll just be pointing at my own machine, so the client and the server will be the same computer. But the idea here is the same. Look for a program that is listening on 1337 and give it the HTTP request that the browser is going to make right now when I hit enter. And then my Node code will be run because the request event will be emitted. I have the server listening and gave it that function. That function will be invoked, which will read the request and allow me to write the response. And an HTTP response will be built and given back to the browser, and then the browser will go on and do what it wants to with it, whatever it's been programmed to do with that particular type of response. So I'll hit enter. And there it is. Hello world. What just happened? Well, if I hit F12 or go to More Tools, Developer Tools in Google Chrome. I'll just refresh, and we can actually see in the Network tab the actual HTTP request and response. Now, if you see a fave icon there, you can just ignore that. The browser is always asking for that little icon that shows up in the tab or when you bookmark it on your phone or tablet. So we'll just ignore that. But we'll go to this localhost request and response. We can see that the URL that we asked for was actually translated to that internal address and the port. And we could see that what came back from the response was that content type text plain that I specified, as well as some other things that Node.js did for me. So I didn't have to think about everything. Also, there's that status code, and the browser knows that 200 meant OK. And if I scroll down, we can see the headers that the browser created for its request that was sent to Node. A lot of things there that Node also is programmed to understand. And since we sent back a text plain as my content type, as my MIME type, the browser was programmed. The programmers of this browser said, well, if it's just plain text and not HTML, we'll just output the text. We won't try to figure out, like you do with HTML, what to do and how to display the various things in it. All right, so maybe it would be useful to step through this. First, we'll need to cancel our Node program. It's still running, waiting for more requests. So I'll hit Control-C. And then I'll go over to the code here. And in Visual Studio Code, I'll set a breakpoint right here at the right head. And then we'll run this in the debugger. So I launch it, and it doesn't just finish and close. Again, it's listening and waiting for a request. So let's make a request, and I'll go over here to the browser and refresh. That will make the request, and then I should hit the breakpoint over here in Visual Studio Code because it's going to cause the Node code to run. And this is actually really nice because the browser, if I had JavaScript code in the browser that I was running, I could actually go to the Sources tab, put a breakpoint on the JavaScript in my browser, and then watch it go over to the breakpoint on the server. So this is a great way to debug. But I'll just refresh here. There's no JavaScript running in the browser right now. So I'll just refresh, and there it went. So the browser made the request, and Visual Studio Code stopped the process here at the breakpoint so I could see what's going on. For starters, let's look at our request object that we named REQ. And it has a whole bunch in it. There's that events property. That means it's an event emitter. So it has the ability to emit and listen for events. And if I scroll down, I'll see a number of things. Here's headers, for example. Here's all the headers that came from the browser. If I go back to the browser, I can see these headers. The browser put these headers together as part of the HTTP request, like user agent, which is what kind of browser is possibly sending this request. And I can see there it is. So I could programmatically say req.headers.userAgent and get access to that data. So HTTP parser inside Node went ahead and parsed this out and converted it into a JavaScript object for me so I could easily access the information that came along for the ride with the request. And look, there's even access to the socket object that defines that, the URL that's actually being requested, and this will be interesting and useful later. So because I didn't request anything but just the address, the URL is just a slash. But if I had said localhost:1337/ something.htm, I'd see /something.htm there. So it's a way for me to know what the request was and everything involved with it. And then there's also a response object, which is a server response object, which has these various methods on it that I can then use. And there they are. and notice that it is writable. It's essentially a writable stream. And so I'll step through, I'll write the header, write it out, hit play. Oh, another request came in. That's strange. If I look at the request, scroll down, oh, it's that favicon request. Well, I'm just outputting back plain text, so it won't really do anything with it. It's looking for an icon file, and I'm giving it plain text here on every request, so the browser will just basically ignore that. So I'll keep going. That second request happened, and there. Hello world. So both HTTP requests came in. I happened to send the same thing as a response, but in this case, I got back what I needed. And notice that the icon file actually also got that same content back, text plain. It just couldn't translate that into an icon. All right, so there it is. I got my response back. And that was made possible for me by this code. So let's stop this and stop and think about this. With just these few lines of code, I was able to build a working web server that accepts HTTP requests and gives me a way to look at them and build an HTTP response and have something show up in the browser. It's pretty neat, right? So I'm not totally abstracted away from what's going on, but I'm pretty abstracted away. I don't have to think about an awful lot of things that are happening under the hood. This is why this example is so popular when people talk about Node, because so much is happening here, and yet it's so little code that I actually have to write in order to get a web server going. So we've done it. What do you think? A web server in Node that I can request from the browser and get a response back. All right, so let's take this and run with it. What else can we do now that we're able to get a request and give a response?